Efrain, how are you?
Pretty good. How about you?
Doing well, thank you. It's nice to have you again. I'm sorry that it took this long to get it posted. So I haven't given you ample time at all to take a look at it before we go over it. So my apologies for that, but it's posted now, and I'm going to go ahead and share the page. Okay. So I have here Latinos and the Great Depression. So what I contend is a very simplistic thesis, really, and on this assignment, and that is that as I have here, three factors seem to habitually dictate Anglo-Latino relations during the early 1900s: economic realities, political occurrences, and the pendulum swing of popular and political sentiment or feeling. When an economic demand existed for Latino labor, when no friction existed between the US and Mexico, when popular sentiment in the US did not swing toward xenophobia, Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants were tolerated, albeit while exploited. Conversely, when the American capitalist system experienced downturns, when the US and Mexico were at odds, and when popular sentiment leaned toward some regressive fictional return to Anglo Saxon Americana, Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans suffered from an acceleration of discrimination. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to foresee that during the Great Depression, there was a degree to which Latinos in the Southwest, in particular, were scapegoated for, quote, stealing necessary jobs, uh, uh, very highly coveted, an insufficient number of jobs. And so there was a backlash against them. All right. So as you see here, I go over some stats with the first three. I apologize, I have the hiccups. The first 3 decades of the 20th century, they think about 1.5 million Mexican immigrants came from Mexico into the U.S. across the border. Some of it were, they put it in push and pull factors. That's probably an outdated way of looking at it, but that's what a lot of historians still do. And so, as far as push factors, I have some in here. The Porfiriato from 1876 to 1910, Porfirio Diaz ruled executively as the so-called president of Mexico for 30 years. His elections and re-elections seemed to a bit of a sham. He was very friendly to U.S. big business, so much so that you see here, welcoming 1.2 billion in American capital. Porfirio Diaz pushed Mexico toward modernity at the cost of rendering approximately 95% of Mexico's arable or grazing land in the hands of rich Mexican hacendados and American corporations. And so as many as 80% of Mexico's population became forced to work in debt peonage. On the rich hacendados farms. Okay. And that's worse. It's like a form of being like a sharecropper on someone else's land. You do the work, they pay you. One of my sources on here says that they were paid like 12 cents a day, uh, or something like that. It was a paltry sum, and they were oftentimes paid in script that you could only spend at your hacendado store. And so they kept you indebted that way. So when you needed a place to stay, when you needed tools and implements and other things and items, you had to buy them on credit and work that credit off on their hacienda. And so it was just a modern derivation of slavery, and a, a large percentage of the Mexican population had to live that way. Then also you have the dislocations of his industrialization process, right? I have that here in here somewhere, um, with the railroads coming in and so forth. So you see here is ubiquitous railroads. Railroad stops became opening markets in and from which machine-made, mass-produced goods, as well as an urban culture, flowed from producers to consumers. Everything from household appliances, modern clothing, public schools, American sports, baseball made its way into Mexico, and access to new industrial-oriented jobs. This displaced artisans, skilled workers, encouraged poorly paid field workers to attain better remunerated industrial-oriented jobs, and arguably broke up the family's cohesion and the parents' control over it. And so those were some dislocating factors that helped push some Mexican families to move. Now, granted, they still think even at 1.5 million, you're looking at up to maybe close to 10% of the Mexican population, which is a high percentage in some respects, moving out of the country to one other particular adjacent country. But also to keep in mind that 90% of Mexican people stayed in the country. A lot of them moved to nearby cities, train depot cities that offered up these new opportunities and new jobs in particular, and markets that flowed and followed from the railroads. And the same thing happened in the US, right, with the quote, opening of the West, with the Transcontinental Railroad and everything. Cities and a more kind of stratified society, with a new kind of white collar middle class emerging, business entrepreneurs, merchants, bankers, and skilled middlemen, skilled workers, foremen at the factories, etc. And so you have these new job opportunities that are following in the wake of technological and industrial changes and infrastructure changes in Mexico. And so this had a dislocating effect to the Mexican people, from especially those living in villages that were contacted by the railroad. And so it convinced, or sometimes didn't even convince, it sometimes necessitated that they join this new market economy in ways that were not traditional, such as having the wife and the kids go to work, and everyone contribute to salaries to the family, instead of having the patriarch be the sole, breadwinner of the family, and the kids stay home under parental supervision, and the mother stays home and does housework, etc. That's going to be challenged during the Porfiriato in the late 1800s. And then you have the dislocation of the Mexican Revolution. And so Porfirio Diaz said after 30 odd years that he wasn't going to run for re-election, and a guy named Francisco Madero contended that there were going to be changes made in Mexico and toward a more democratic constitutional republic. And it intimidated and threatened Diaz sufficiently for him to change his mind, and he ran for re-election again. And they were afraid that he rigged it in beating Madero in the election, and so that thus began Madero's uprising. And he had several guys: Alvaro Obregón in Sonora, Pancho Villa in Chihuahua, Emiliano Zapata down in Morelos, Venustiano Carranza in Coahuila. These different kind of caudillos, these leaders of different regions, rose up against at first Diaz, and then against his successor, or his second successor, because Madero's rule was very short-lived, and then he was arrested and executed by Huerta. And so it became a fight against Victoriano Huerta. And it both sides engaged in depredations and burning fields and supplies and committing atrocities against one another, both the federales underneath Huerta and the rebels, or the constitutionalists as they called themselves, fighting against him. And so that dislocated the lives of millions of Mexican people, and that definitely triggered a large contingent of that 1.5 million Mexican immigrants crossing the border into Los Estados Unidos. And so you have those types of push factors, and then you have the pull factor, which was largely not social, largely not political, but economic, right? And sometimes economics reign. um, it reigns sometimes as a realm of reality. Uh, when you look at the progressive era, we've already talked about that. There was kind of a condescending culture from the progressives, where they were going to take care of the less fortunate people, but they were going to rule them and teach them how to properly live, and in the proper way of socioeconomic ascension, of realizing the American dream with their settlement house projects, etc. Um, and their paternalistic rule over, which we just covered recently, over like the Philippines and Puerto Rico, etc., and Cuba for 4 years. But then in the 20s, there was a culture war between the traditionalists and the moderns. The moderns were embracing the changes of what they call the new era of the 1920s. Uh, for the first time, America became urbanized. More people were living in a city of 2,000 people or more than were not living in a city of 2,000 or more for the first time. Um, Electrification, the automobile, jazz music, the Harlem Renaissance, the new woman and the flapper. All kinds of changes were occurring in the 1920s, and the moderns were those who were embracing such changes, and not to mention hyper consumerism, buying things on credit, especially that are not necessities, right? Luxury goods. And so Americans, that's the popular image of the 20s, right? The roaring 20s, that Americans were kind of going crazy, letting go of all inhibitions, in crushing Victorian era norms, about sexuality, that there's to be no sexuality outside of marriage between husband and wife. They kind of shattered that. If you look at the Muncie, Indiana report, and the writings of Lois Long in New York, and the writings of F. Scott Fitzgerald about the young women going crazy. And then it's as seen in Hollywood with Clara Bow and Louise Brooks and other actresses that kind of played the femme fatale in the movies, and in some cases in real life as Hollywood stars. And so you had the White Sox scandal, uh, Fatty Arbuckle scandal, the scandals of Warren G. Harding's presidency, the Teapot Dome scandal, his affairs on his wife, etc. So the 20s were pretty wild. But the traditionalists, right? They had enough pull in Congress to bring about some kind of xenophobic legislation that put a quota system. Well, the quota system had been established by the progressives in 1917, but they took it to a higher or lower, if you might say, level, in having restrictions set specifically against specific countries. But it was particularly in Europe. They had, remember, the Chinese Exclusion Act still in effect at this time. And so with the Mexican immigrants and so forth, on paper, they kind of ignored them, with the exception of having certain caveats. And what were those conditions? The conditions were they were to have right here, the medical exam, the head tax, the literacy test, and the public charge evaluation. So those were the requirements that they had to meet. The head tax went from $8 up to $18, which was a lot of money for anyone in the 1920s, but especially for poor, misplaced Mexican immigrants coming up. The medical exam was pretty rudimentary. Make sure you didn't have a communicable disease that you were bringing across the border. The literacy test could be in just a single language. So it could be in Spanish, but even so, and literacy wasn't bad as far as the rates in Mexico. At the end period of the Porfiriato, a lot of immigrants came from northern Mexico, and literacy was higher, supposedly, in northern Mexico than in southern Mexico. And so that didn't pose too strong of a deterrent, but yet it did to an extent. And then public charge evaluation was that they wanted to make sure that you could work for a decent amount of time. They were copying this from Ellis Island in New York, right, with the Statue of Liberty, with immigrants from Europe in particular, particularly Southern and Eastern Europe, who they generically called the new immigrants. And I might put that up for you to read as supplemental reading, just to give you context to how they treated immigrants in the early 1900s. My goodness, they would put chalk on their jackets. They put like an X if they thought that there was something mentally off with you or psychologically, and that could keep you from being accepted. And they had humiliating tests where they would make you in a large room filled with lots of other people stripped naked to look for any identifiable deformities, abnormalities, or any signs of a great sickness. And so they quote fumigated for lice and made shower the Mexican immigrants, and it was a very dehumanizing experience. So it wasn't pleasant, and it wasn't intended to be. And there's an irony there, right? When you look at that poem by Emma Lazarus on the Statue of Liberty, "Come bring your huddled masses to us, your refuse, your poor," right? And America will open her arms to them. Not really. And so in the 20s, the traditionalists, they were not big on foreign immigration, and they didn't pretend to be. But the overriding factor in the popular narrative is business was booming, and big business, in particular in the West, agribusiness, needed exploitable cheap labor. So hence, sometimes money talks, no matter how kind of xenophobic and uber conservative a lot of Americans were in the 1920s when it came to ethnicity and nationality. A lot of them were willing to tolerate Mexican immigration for that reason, for economic reasons, because they were needed to do the jobs that other people didn't want to perform. So you see here, right, they constituted the majority of farm workers as early as 1920, Latinos, that is, right? They were paid $1 to $2 a day, as opposed to 12 cents per day on a typical Mexican hacienda. Clearing land paid only 50 cents per day in Texas, but Hispanic miners earned well over $2 a day, and Hispanic railroad laborers could expect $1 to $2 a day as well. And so the argument is that it was a lesser evil for Mexican Americans. They were making more money here in the Roaring 20s in the States than a lot of them would have been down in Mexico. And so hence a lot of them came for that reason, for economic reasons, and the Americans opened their arms to them largely for that reason as well. And so Hoover himself, one of the three Republican presidents of the 1920s, who was conservative himself, pretty much encouraged the State Department to have a loose interpretation of the criteria and to allow in a good number of Mexican immigrants for that reason, for economic reasons, so that they could work those jobs. All right, and then this next section I find pretty interesting is the term acculturation, right? is when the Mexican Americans came, they assimilated into Americans in some ways, but they also encouraged Americans to adopt some Latino characteristics of culture as well. So you see here, Mexican American communities greatly expanded from 1900 to 30. The author Ray Suarez attests, right? They were just as American as apple pie. That actually, it's in Spanish. That's why I put it in Spanish there. That's a direct quote because the book is written in Spanish, and hopefully my translations are up to par. He claims that interweaving Mexican culture with popular music, the movies, and US fashion, Mexican Americans became a hybrid people, both Mexican and American. They began to marry whom they chose. They bought automobiles, radios, and new era attire or clothing. They went to the movies. They shopped at department stores. They enjoyed jazz dance halls, pool halls, and bars. However, also in relation to the Mexican consulate, Los Angeles Latinos formed Mexican American organizations in the 20s. They celebrated Mexican holidays, and they formed a Chicano theater and Spanish-speaking schools and newspapers. So they didn't completely assimilate. It was a mutual, like I said, they call it a culturation or cultural synthesis, um, um, where both sides kind of embraced one another. This cultural mixing, Suarez claims, was mutual as it changed the people that came here. Meanwhile, the new immigrants at the same time changed the places to which they arrived, right? In places like LA and San Antonio, gringos flocked to Mexican restaurants, encouraged old Spanish architecture and downtown districts, and intermarried with Latinos. Granted, Suarez contends that many Anglo newcomers to LA from the East Coast despreciaban a los mexicanos. They despised the Mexicans, and that contemporary literature still depicted them ironically as lazy, go figure. However, Mexican barrios in the Southwest were, quote, prospering, according to Ray Suarez. And then, as I have here, this all changed when the Great Depression hit the nation. A quarter of the working age population, up to 13 million or more, lost employment and income. Thousands of Midwestern migrants, having lost mortgages to their farms and producing wheat or corn, found themselves heading for the California agricultural fields to do migrant work, many given the name Okies. Demand for their produce plunged with unemployment as Europe put up tariff walls from buying their produce as well. Banks went under by the thousands as they dabbled in the cascading stock market and had wealthy clients withdraw their deposits in a frenzy. Such desperate Okies formed shanty towns up and down the Central Valley of California, vying for the Latinos' jobs in the fields. At this moment, xenophobia was no longer mitigated by economic motives, but assisted by them. Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans lumped together became a convenient scapegoat of job thieves amidst a popular consensus that Americans, quote, Americans, should be taken care of firstly. All right. So you see here, suddenly employment amongst Latinos skyrocketed to rates higher than those amongst Anglos. I couldn't get an exact date figure on that, which I'm still curious about. Because my goodness, if it was a quarter of the general population and it was higher than that for Latinos, that's crazy. So you're looking at much higher than 25% unemployment rate for Latinos during the Depression. The New Deal, right? And I may put up something subsequent on the New Deal for you to read as well as context. Franklin Roosevelt came in and was elected overwhelmingly in 32 by generically stating he was going to have a New Deal. And in this New Deal, the government took a much bigger act of participation in the economy. So, for instance, they tried to rectify the problem of supply and demand. Much too high supply and not nearly enough demand, right? So that goods and products, including food, ironically, were just stockpiled without people having the money or, quote, demand formally to buy it. And so they established the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, with the industrial companies and the Agricultural Adjustment Act with the farmers, which are pretty similar in the MO that they followed, is they encouraged them to cut down their supply and encourage them to set their prices at set marks. In return, the government bailed them out, subsidized them. So with agriculture, they told the farmers, okay, we have way too many almonds, for instance. That's just hypothetical. I don't think at that time we were anywhere where we are now with almonds, but let's just say too many almonds. So we're going to subsidize, 30% of the California farmers to change their crop from almonds to peaches, let's say. And so they cut down the trees, they uproot it, and they want the land to lay fallow for a season for the nitrogen and other nutrients to be replenished in the soil. So in the meantime, there's no work to be done, but they're being funded by the federal government to do this. Well, what do you think they do to their migrant workers? They lay them off. They don't need them, and the federal government's giving them money. And the federal government gave the landowners this money, these subsidies, not the sharecroppers, not the migrant day laborers and field workers. So at any rate, the New Deal also provided work relief. The WPA was the most popular at any given time, had like 2.5 million people working directly for the federal government on public works. So, building bridges and stadiums and sidewalks, etc. The CCC, they put young men in like army barracks and only let them keep like 1/3 of their salary and made them send the other 2/3 of their salary back home to feed their families, because this was called Keynesian economics or Keynesian economics, where you believe that the barometer, the measuring stick for deciding how healthy an economy is and ought to be directly related to the purchasing power of the average person. That the government needs to ensure that the average person has money in his or her pocket to spend at the marketplace, and that primes the pump and keeps everything going. And so hence the government was doing just that with these work relief programs, putting millions of Americans to work directly and paying them weekly to put money in their pockets. Now, there was nothing discriminatory in these New Deal programs that I've come across at the federal level, saying that you're not to give any jobs to African Americans, to Latinos, to Asian Americans, etc. But the problem is in such a large country, is that these federal projects were carried out at the local and regional level, and the local and regional authorities had their own biases, their own prejudices, and they were the ones that implemented it at the end of the day. And so they had ways of giving the jobs, right, or the funds first to Anglo-Americans and then to Latinos and African Americans after that. And so according to Alan Brinkley in his US textbook, he says that Latinos and African Americans were shortchanged during the New Deal. But like I said, not necessarily anything overtly intended by Franklin Roosevelt himself, but just it ended up that way at the local level. And then you had repatriation. You had the Alien Labor Act in California, and they actually had raids in which they came into Los Angeles, into the famous plaza, and tried to get as many Latinos as possible and put them on the railroad and send them across the border down to Mexico for, quote, taking Americans' jobs, believe it or not. And so that actually happened. And yes, you have cases of mistaken identity in which Mexican Americans who were born here, and by virtue of the 14th Amendment, having been born in the States, were just as American as apple pie, as Ray Suarez says, and perhaps had never even seen Mexico, the land itself, were deported amongst some of those numbers. So it says here, in coordination, local businessmen, federal and local authorities in LA carried out a series of they let it be known just ahead of time in the newspapers, raids that began with a forced deportation of over 300 Mexican immigrants in 1931. Whether via such forced repatriations or by their own volition, approximately 500,000 Latinos returned to Mexico in the 1930s. All right. So, Efrain, do you feel okay about this assignment? You have any questions?
Yeah, I feel okay, but I don't have questions
Okay.
right now.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let me get your name down. All right. So I'll be sure to give you 10 extra credit points. Okay, Efrain?
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you've earned it for sure. All right. And so I don't have any other comments really. I mean, that's kind of the gist of the assignment, the gist of the topic. So if you don't have any other questions, Efrain, I'm going to go ahead and let you go, and we'll call it a week. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. All right. Because honestly, if you have any questions, I'll stay.
No, I don't have no questions. Thank you
Okay.
though.
Okay. All right, Efrain. Uh, Le agradezco a usted muchísimo. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good
Uh,
week.
you too.
Bye bye.